Hello and welcome. So, let's talk about one of the biggest questions in economics. What's really the best way for a developing nation to grow? I mean, how do you go from struggling to thriving? It's a huge question, and the answers are fascinatingly different. When you boil it all down, there are really two major schools of thought here, and believe me, they are practically polar opposites. One strategy is all about lifting everybody up at the same time. The other is about picking a champion and letting them pull everyone else forward. So on one side, you have the idea of balanced growth. This is kind of the conventional wisdom. You develop everything, agriculture, industry, services, all at the same time, in a nice, steady way. But then, on the other side, you've got this much more radical idea, unbalanced growth. This theory says, nope, you've got limited resources, so pour everything you have into just a few super strategic sectors.
So in this explainer, here's our game plan. We're going to walk through these 5 key areas to really get our heads around this radical idea. We'll compare the two strategies, dive into how unbalanced growth is supposed to work, look at the good and the bad, and then see how they really stack up against each other.
All right, let's get right into it. To really understand unbalanced growth, we first have to get a handle on the idea it was arguing against, the theory of balanced growth.
The whole concept of balanced growth is pretty intuitive, right? It says you should launch a bunch of different industries all at once. So imagine you start a clothing factory, a shoe factory, and maybe a bicycle factory all at the same time. The idea is that the workers from each factory will then have money to buy products from the other factories. You're creating your own customers. The goal is a big, self-sustaining market where everything moves forward in perfect harmony.
But, and this is a big but, there's a massive flaw in this thinking. It's right there in this quote. If a developing country actually had enough money, skills, and resources to start everything at once, well, why would it be underdeveloped to begin with? It's a huge catch-22, and it's the theory's greatest weakness. And it's exactly this problem that prompted the economist A.O. Hirschman to come along with his theory of unbalanced growth. His whole perspective was just completely different. Hirschman basically said that development isn't this smooth, straight line. Real growth, he argued, actually happens when you deliberately create imbalances. You push one sector so far ahead that it creates this intense pressure, this tension that forces other sectors to catch up. For him, growth isn't a harmony. It's a chain of disequilibria. One imbalance creates the next, and that's what pulls you forward. Okay, so if you're going to create an imbalance, the big question is, where? And there are two main choices. On one hand, you've got SOC, or social overhead capital. Think of this as the foundation, your roads, power plants, schools. On the other hand, you have DPA, or directly productive activities. These are the factories, farms, and businesses that are actually making stuff. The whole strategy hinges on picking one and pouring your investment into it. Now, this graph shows those two paths perfectly. Let's break it down. The first path goes from A to A prime. This is where you build up your infrastructure, your SOC, first. You build the roads and power plants, which creates an incentive, a pressure, that pulls the factories, the DPA, along with it to point B. The second path is the other way around. You start with the factories first, going from A to B prime. This creates a shortage of infrastructure, which puts pressure on the government to build it, moving from A to B. See? Both paths use imbalance as the engine to get to the same goal. So how exactly does this imbalance actually work its magic? I mean, how does it drive growth? The answer lies in this really powerful concept that Hirschman called linkages.
Okay, so every industry creates two kinds of connections, or linkages. First, you have backward linkages. A car factory, for instance, needs steel, tires, glass, and paint. So it creates demand that pulls all those supply industries up with it. Then you have forward linkages. A steel mill, for example, produces tons of cheap steel. That cheap steel then encourages or pushes other industries to start up, like car factories or appliance manufacturers.
The whole strategy then is to find that one golden industry, the one with the most powerful combination of these backward and forward linkages. You want the industry that's going to pull and push the rest of the economy the hardest. And Hirschman pointed to the iron and steel industry as a perfect example of this.
Now, this leads to another one of Hirschman's totally fascinating, kind of mind-bending ideas. The last industry's first strategy. It sounds crazy, but it means you actually start the production process in reverse. So step 1, you just assemble cars using imported parts. Once you prove there's a market, you use those backward linkages to start making the parts, like tires and seats, locally. And then finally, you go even further back and create the industries that make the raw materials, like steel and rubber. You build the industry from the finish line backwards.
Of course, no theory is perfect, right? And this unbalanced growth strategy, well, it definitely has its own potential downsides and some pretty serious criticisms.
Look, when you deliberately create an imbalance, things can get tricky. Pouring all your investment into one sector can cause prices to spike. That's inflation. Other sectors can get starved of resources, which can create real shortages and hardship for people. And maybe most importantly, the entire strategy depends on people and the government responding correctly to the pressure you create. And, well, that's never a guarantee.
So where does that leave us? In the end, which of these two big strategies is actually better? Let's put them head to head and see.
This table really makes the differences pop. You can see balanced growth is focused on fixing the size of the market. That's a demand-side problem. Unbalanced growth, though, starts from the opposite end. It says the real problem is a scarcity of resources, a supply-side problem. And look at the process. One is smooth and harmonious. The other is like a seesaw advance, full of tension and, frankly, a bit disorderly.
But for all their differences, and this is really key, both theories agree on one absolutely fundamental point. Every single part of the economy is connected to every other part. They're interdependent. The big disagreement is just about the best way to use that fact to your advantage.
At the end of the day, according to the source material we're looking at, for developing countries where resources are almost always tight, trying to do everything at once just might not be possible. And that's why the path of unbalanced growth, as challenging as it is, often seems like the more practical, more realistic choice.
So the final question we're left with is a big one. Is a messy, tension-filled, and kind of disorderly path the only realistic way for a country to develop? Is that calculated strategic imbalance the true engine of growth? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for watching.